Hi all, I am Julia, and I am here to analyze a reading comprehension passage with you today. There are so many things to notice when practicing your RC skills, and if you're not used to reading in the way that's required, it's very easy to miss subtle keywords, important points, or other helpful clues. I'm going to go through this TTP passage with you to show you some of the things it is worth noticing and how they can help you understand the passage. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I am going to read through a passage, and then we will break it down into various aspects and clues that are worth noticing. And then at the end, I will give a paragraph by paragraph breakdown and an overall summary. So let's start with our passage. In the mid-20th century, anthropomorphism, the attribution of human traits or purposes to non-human entities such as animals, had long been frowned upon by most members of the scientific community, who perceived there to be a clear dividing line between the psychology and intentions of humans and the consciousness and motivations of other animals. Researchers engaging in any degree of anthropomorphism was considered an unacceptable flaw in methodology that inevitably results in loss of objectivity. However, as a scientific community outsider with no college degree and little training, Jane Goodall was unaffected by this view when she first entered the Tanzanian wilderness to study chimpanzees. Consequently, she was unimpeded from making certain groundbreaking discoveries that would forever change the way non-human animals are perceived. During her first period of field study in 1960, having observed chimpanzee facial expressions and actions, such as their using touch to greet and comfort each other, she concluded that chimpanzees have unique personalities and human-like emotions. Also, during this period, she observed chimpanzees fashioning simple tools that they then used to fish for termites. Since, at that time, the common wisdom was that humans alone among all animals modify objects to create tools, this discovery stunned the scientific world. Later, in 1970, her observation that chimpanzees seemed to express awe at the sight of a spectacular waterfall led her and others to believe that chimpanzees have experiences akin to human spirituality. Goodall's work has been sufficient to convince many of her peers that human and animal mental, emotional, and spiritual characteristics lie on a continuum rather than on two sides of a dividing line. Harvard's Stephen Jay Gould used the words, quote, "one of the great achievements of 20th century scholarship," end quote. Nevertheless, others have termed her work anecdotal or even unbounded speculation because, as diligent as it is, her conclusions are largely based upon a somewhat limited set of observations made by a single person. However, more recently, teams of researchers using empirical methods involving large samples have produced evidence indicating that her views reflect reality. Let's look at some different opinions in this passage. There are some opinions in the first paragraph. However, these are mostly there to set the context. Anthropomorphism had long been frowned upon by most members of the scientific community, and researchers engaging in any degree of anthropomorphism was considered an unacceptable flaw. That is to give context to what happens next in the passage. Then we move on to the second paragraph. The other unusual thing about this passage is that it is based on some observed research, and so the researcher also has opinions that are there as evidence of her interpretations and how they were significantly different than the interpretations of many of her peers. But there is one highlighted opinion that is important to notice. She is looking at these chimpanzees and seeing things that people have never noticed before. And since at the time the common wisdom was that humans alone among all animals modify objects to create tools, this discovery stunned the scientific world. So because Jane Goodall doesn't know about the prejudice against anthropomorphism, she isn't affected by it, and so she is able to see things that previous researchers have not noticed that just shocks the scientific community. Here are these things she's observing that they have never even considered. And then in the final paragraph, we have a direct quote, which is always a good clue that an opinion is going to show up. And then we have, after Mr. Gould used the words "one of the great achievements of 20th century scholarship" to describe Goodall's work, we have this contrasting opinion that other unnamed people have termed her work anecdotal or even unbounded speculation. Next, we're going to look at some markers. Markers are terms in the passage that give it structure so that you can see how the thoughts are supposed to relate to each other. As I mentioned earlier, because the first paragraph is about background, it doesn't have places to pivot from. Consider it the foundational piece. However, starting from the second paragraph, we have got some markers to notice. The second paragraph starts with "however," which shows that what we're about to learn is going to be contrasting against what we learned in the first paragraph. Then we learn about this researcher who was unaffected by this view that many researchers had. Consequently, because she was unaffected by the view, she was unimpeded from making certain groundbreaking discoveries that would forever change the way non-human animals are perceived. Then it talks about her research, and the marker also further gives examples of her research that then lead to, since at that time the common wisdom was that humans alone among all animals modify objects to create tools, this discovery stunned the scientific world. So it gives some examples of her research, and then it explains why her research was so surprising. And then at the end, later, it gives another example of something that she observed in her research. In the final paragraph, there are some markers that indicate the scientific community's varied reactions to Goodall's work. So Goodall's work has been sufficient to convince many of her peers, is more context for the marker that is this long dash, where it gives this statement: she has done work sufficient to convince many of her peers, and then it gives an example that Harvard's Stephen Jay Gould considers her work one of the great achievements of 20th century scholarship. Pretty positive. She has clearly convinced him that human and animal mental, emotional, and spiritual characteristics lie on a continuum. Then it says, nevertheless, here are the people she has not convinced. And it gives some information about their opinion, but it finishes with, however, more recently, teams are using empirical methods that end up validating some of her observational work. Finally, we're going to look at some clues for tone. Tone can be difficult to pick up on in reading comp passages because it can be subtle. A lot of the tones will be subtle and the clues won't be super obvious if you are not looking for them, so let me point them out for you. Since this passage is about Jane Goodall, let's look at how the author chooses to describe her work. Jane Goodall was unaffected by this anti-anthropomorphism bias that was so prevalent in the scientific community. Consequently, she was unimpeded. She, as a consequence of her lack of college degree and her lack of immersion in the scientific community, she was unimpeded, so she was not stopped from making certain groundbreaking discoveries that would forever change the way non-human animals are perceived. Since she was an outsider, she was able to do work that no one who wasn't an outsider could do. And her work forever changed the way that we perceive non-human animals. Then it gives some details about her work, and it shows that the common wisdom was that humans alone, among all animals, modify objects to create tools. So her discovery stunned the scientific world. They could not believe it. How about the reactions to her research? Notice this quote that was selected to support the fact that her work had been sufficient to convince many of her peers. One of the great achievements of 20th century scholarship. Always consider both why the author includes various opinions on a subject and how they frame those opinions, because that can offer clues for tone. Compare the pro-Goodall opinion with this very flattering quote and how it's presented with how the critical opinion is presented. Nevertheless, others have termed her work anecdotal or even unbounded speculation. And then it says, because as diligent as it is, even though people are criticizing her work, the author reminds us that she was diligent. Finally, notice how the author chooses to finish the passage with some subsequent validation for Goodall's research. However, more recently, teams of researchers using empirical methods involving large samples have produced evidence indicating that her views reflect reality. That is telling in and of itself. The last thought that they want you to leave with is there has been, people complain about how her research wasn't empirical enough, but there has been subsequent empirical research that validates her views. Now let's look at the breakdown for the passage. Here is the paragraph by paragraph breakdown I would do for this passage. I do recommend a paragraph by paragraph breakdown if there is multiple paragraphs, or just a structure breakdown if there is a single paragraph. It's super helpful with structure questions. But this passage starts, it introduces a concept, anthropomorphism. It tells you how people feel about it, not positive. Then, paragraph 2, it says, hey, here's a person that was not affected by this negative view, and as a result, she was able to make certain groundbreaking discoveries and permanently change the way we perceive non-human animals. And paragraph 3 talks about the impact of the researcher's work and how it has been sufficient to convince some, though not all, of her scientist peers that humans and other animals are more similar than had been previously believed. Additionally, some recent research has provided confirmation for her views. So the overall story of this passage is that Jane Goodall, who was unimpeded by the prevailing view of anthropomorphism, made groundbreaking discoveries and changed people's perception of non-human animals. As you can see, there are so many different things to notice in these passages. You might, or probably are, used to subconsciously picking up on these markers and tone clues, but you may not be as used to answering direct questions about them, so you can get a feel for things, but then when faced with a direct question, it's hard to articulate the support for why you feel that way. As you read more of these passages with the aspects and clues in mind, you will get better at both spotting them and being able to articulate them into answers for various reading comp questions. Keep studying, and I will see you next time.